You had to sit on the porch, but, yep. Wait a minute. This is all we're gonna have. I'd like to call the Law Enforcement, Public Safety, Health, and Welfare Committee to order. Today's May the 16th, 2023. It's 4:30 p.m. We'd like to have a moment of silence. Mr. Hart, would you lead us in our Pledge of Allegiance?
And communication.
Skipped over that.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And now we'll get back to the agenda. Root.
Yes, I'm glad. Pray with me if you'd like to. Father, just want to take this time and during this meeting to thank you for our law enforcement personnel, our first responders, all those who are take up all their time really and are devoted their life's work to public safety, to keeping us safe, to guarding our property and our persons. I'm very grateful for that. I pray that you would give them enthusiasm and just wisdom in their work, and that you would come alongside this committee so it could support those folks. Pray in your name. Amen. Oh, we already did the pledge.
Okay, next on the agenda is approval of the minutes of February 21st, 2023. Do I hear a motion?
Make a motion.
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
That is 3-0.
And we're here today to discuss the commercial junkyard ordinance that's been proposed by the Planning Commission. They've been working on it quite some time, and they've passed it up to the Law Enforcement Committee for our review to look at it and make any changes, required changes or requested changes to it. It is fairly concise in a lot of ways. I'm speaking from my own opinion of it. I've had a request to include a exemption for service-related marine and automotive businesses. And you know as well as I do, some of these businesses, because of constraints of the lot or whatever, they can appear to be a junkyard, and depending on what type of businesses they're doing, so they've asked for an exemption, so that would be considered. Also, one of the things, and I've been to several of the Planning Commission meetings, and it's been tossed back and forth of whether or not to grandfather existing junkyards, commercial junkyards, not individual, but existing commercial. And I don't believe this version does that. Am I correct in that, Mr. Coley or Mr.
Yeah, I'll be glad to, Mr. Chairman, if I may. It does not. If we look at 32-755, you see the building blocks for identifying the grandfathered businesses, and then at least leading up to how they're going to be treated if they could lose their grandfathered status by one of these 5 items or others that are listed. However, if you look at Exhibit A to the documents, which I don't have, I know, right there. That is, Planning Commission made a motion right at the last time it had, that it worked with this, that if you're looking at Exhibit A, that if there is a violation, a safety violation, that the items triggered A1 through 4 could be placed into and be the ramifications. Now, that was the motion from the Planning Commission, but they did get to the point where this is the sticking issue, the grandfathering and the nonconformity, so that's when they decided that going to law enforcement and getting y'all's input would be helpful.
Okay. Me personally, I would like to see a grandfather clause. I'm not a grandfather clause. I think a grandfather clause would take some of the effectiveness out of it. I think all commercial, if it's a truly commercial junkyard, should abide by the applicable laws along with everyone else. I'm also, I guess I'll have to make a motion for this, is to resend this back to the Planning Commission. Since the Planning Commission has new members that have not had an opportunity to look at this and express their views on it, I would like for it to go back to Planning Commission, for them to review it and put their input into it.
So that's motion.
I'd like to make a motion for that, yes.
I'll second it. And I'd like to comment, I would like, I don't know what it would look like, but to look into electric vehicles and junkyards and storage, because they have a lot of hazardous material in them, and it's become a growing problem as we move forward. And they, when they get in accidents, insurance companies tend to just total them out because it's so expensive to repair them. So I would like for the Planning Commission to look into that as well, if I can tie that into the motion.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, briefly, that was an issue that was talked about at the Planning Commission, and I looked into, and we're kind of surprised, or I was at least, that the regulatory law and statutory law certainly hadn't caught up to dealing with the large batteries. So there wasn't a whole lot of guidance which you would expect from the federal level, and so they essentially, it's a hazardous material, so it's going to be treated as a hazardous material. And certainly the several components of those batteries are. So it falls under the hazardous waste law. So it is covered there. If something's in the ground, it's in the ground. It's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but it is covered there. But as I recall, Mr. Coley, tell me if I'm incorrect, the notion was we'll rely on that, and as the law, rely on the hazardous waste laws. And as the law specifically related to the batteries develops, then the Planning Commission was going to consider taking up a separate ordinance on that. Is that correct?
We had discussed a couple options. One of them was also just adding the guidelines that whatever the manufacturer's guidelines need to be followed in the dismantling of the electric vehicle. But it's just following whatever the manufacturer's recommendations are.
So am I hearing that, Mr. Ritter, you saying that the federal guidelines for disposal haven't been described yet?
They haven't reached certainly the level of maturity and evolution that you would expect, that I expected at least. So it all, I don't want to say reverted because it's a different type, but the law that everyone leaned on was the hazardous waste laws, which have certainly been in place and been refined over many, many years. The case law and statutory amendments and such like that. And the components of those batteries, lithium, nickel, there's a ton of them that would fall under that hazardous waste law. So you can't just go dump them in a river, can't just let them seep into the water table. All of these things are covered, but specifically the batteries, I didn't find anything that we could anchor into that I felt solid on, that it was solid ground. I think there will be soon. I mean, it's got to be.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
And I just did a quick Google search, try to find if any other communities, because some communities are further ahead in electric vehicle use, than we are. And Google, I didn't turn up a whole lot. But, there may be things in that's going to change the setback requirements. Maybe a density requirement for the level of vehicles. You don't want to get a critical mass of you see one burning that white hot, so, I appreciate the planning commission looking at it, but I think we can, if there's a way we can maybe just look ahead to be a step ahead of maybe federal regulations, just, if there's somebody out, there may be in Europe, European nations, they may be further ahead on what their communities are doing.
Could use that as a model or something for the planning commission to work over. And Ms. Spicer, I think, was the one who brought that up and then had done some initial research. So I'm assuming, was that a motion? Was that an amendment?
If I can, as part of his direction to look into that.
Make an amendment to the motion.
And I'll take it back and I'll bring all the law that I can grab with some examples. If it's extra jurisdictional, then great, and we can work it up from there.
And I sent out an email, a mass email, and I didn't have it counted. It's probably close to 100 replies. A lot of them are, I like it, a lot of them I hate it, but there's a lot with some pretty good citizen input. And I'll try to tabulate that as well and pass that on to the planning commission.
Okay. We need to take a vote on that motion.
Yes, sir.
All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Any other comments? Lynn, Mr. Hart, you got any comments?
Well, our question, these minor street location is prohibited. And they describe minor streets as when it has a cul-de-sac on it. I just rode on a street that had probably 2.5 miles in the cul-de-sac on the end of it. And it's in Oconee County. And to tell you where it's at, it's on the Clemson property down there at the research center. And I don't think they'll be putting any junk on it. Well, actually, they got some sitting there now, but they probably don't consider it junk. So I'm wondering about that. Well, who's going to determine that's a minor or major road?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, so for the members of the public, the definition, it's for minor local streets, that shall mean a street that is designed and serves primarily to access abutting residential properties. Minor local streets typically terminate in a cul-de-sac, loop, or other turnaround and contain no more than 2 access points. The Planning Commission's intent with this was to keep new junkyards out of or off of minor streets, off of which would be, small cul-de-sacs, or it doesn't have to end in a cul-de-sac. It could be anything that's really, I think what they're targeting is a purely residential area. So I know that's where it came from. That was the idea. And having them instead go on major local streets, which are defined as a street that is designed and serves primarily to access abutting residential and commercial properties and other streets or roadways. Major local streets are further characterized as having 2 or more access points and receiving traffic from minor local streets. So they're making that distinction between the 2 types of roadways and saying that the major local streets would be the better ones to locate these businesses on.
Are you telling me that if there's another access or another way off of that street, that it's not considered a minor? The reason I say that, this same street is the one that goes up by the research center and goes on over, and then there's a road cuts off of it and goes into the overflow parking for the Clemson ball games.
The way that I read this, I didn't develop the definition in whole. I think I tweaked with it a little bit, but that it wouldn't have, a minor local street wouldn't have more than 2 access points. So not coming from another cul-de-sac, but coming from another area, thoroughfare, or whatever, that it's only going to have the 2. So if you've got a T-shaped street, so you've got a minor local street and you've got access from a major street, access from, another major street on both ends, and then another major street that's coming up at the bottom of that T, for example, I think that would make it a major local street where you could put one.
What I just described with the cul-de-sac would be a major, because you go up, when you first get on it, you turn to the right and go to the research center. You go on out another, let's say, 1/4 mile, the road turns to the left, and that goes down into the overflow parking. And then if you go another mile, you go to the cul-de-sac.
I would think that would fit as a major. I mean, the overflow parking is one issue, but you've got the access from Research Center, and the notion was, and I wasn't there with all the conversations because the planning commission did work on this for a long time, was, that's not a purely commercial area. So I think it would fit as a major, based on my understanding of how you're describing the road, which could be a place that this would be placed. James, feel free to jump in at any
That's
point.
accurate. I think the intent was to limit new commercial junkyards on purely residential areas where it's all residential use, not zone, but use.
That's all I have.
Thank you, sir.
I don't believe I have any other comments on it. Matt?
All right, we'll get it back to the planning commission and work up on some more on the batteries and get the commission members and everybody's input.
I'll send you that email that I received about the exemption, requesting an exemption. All right, moving on to the next discussion regarding the development of an ordinance to foster the identification, safe repair, or removal of structure that become unsafe for occupation as a result of fire damage and natural disasters. I got to pull it up.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to do an intro for this?
I would,
that help?
thank you.
All right. During the last Law Enforcement Public Safety Health and Welfare Committee meeting, I was charged to develop an ordinance that was focused, initial discussion was really a targeted focus on burned buildings, and then by way of the motion from Mr. Mize to expand that focus to burned and structures that are damaged, habitable structures that are damaged by a natural disaster. So the thrust of this ordinance is just to hit those two. As we discussed before, the property maintenance code would cover all of these, but it is it's very broad brushstrokes and deals with any conditions, a whole myriad of conditions, but any conditions that could render a building unsafe, unfit for habitation, or less than that. So this one is particularly targeted toward burned and, excuse me, I don't know how to phrase it, but buildings damaged by a natural disaster. One of those two. This text that's in this ordinance, I would say 90% of it tracks close to verbatim with state law. In section 31, 15, 310, and the following sections in state law gives a county the ability to draft an ordinance. It's cumulative to the International Property Maintenance Code. It's cumulative to any other nuisance type regulations we put out there. So it doesn't take the place of. But this is, I want to say, Sumter has it exactly like this. Greenville has something very similar. Spartanburg is pretty similar. Horry County is pretty much verbatim, and so is Beaufort. Those are ones that I know of that really grab the state statute and run with that. So that's what you have here. It seemed like the best fit because we know we've got the state law backing on it, so I'm not creating the wheel anew. So that's where it came from.
Mr. Durham, Mr.
So if we pass this ordinance, would it exempt the county government? Because we would need to comply as well with their abandoned buildings. So I looked at it and I get the intent of it. I think it needs a lot of more work. And that's not, I know you rough draft, first go. But just, like the public officer, would that be a code enforcement officer?
It would be up to the county administrator to appoint the individual. I would say code enforcement or building code individual is a good person to hold that office who has that experience with structural integrity and issues of that nature. Yes, sir.
And I'm just gonna kind of go down the list, Mr. Mize, if that's okay, just
Yes, sir.
down the ordinance. Like section 4, if you're not careful, that to me could be a violation of Fourth Amendment. There's some changes I recommend where it says the public officer may exercise such power as may be necessary or convenient to carry out. I would reword it somehow to say powers as granted by state or federal law. And then Alpha and Charlie, both of those is kind of along those same lines. I'm still reading, I apologize.
but I did, this section is lifted from the South Carolina Code. So it's consistent with state law, but I do not have any hesitance writing inconsistent with state and federal law. This is what I talked about. Most of this is verbatim with state law.
Yeah.
One area that I did add something was to item C, and are conducted in a manner consistent with state and federal law. Had the same concerns about complaints regarding unlawful searches. So I wanted to add that language in there, which is similar to what we have in relation to the property maintenance code and the code enforcement officer's actions.
And then like if you go down to section 5, section Charlie underneath that, dilapidation, disrepair, or structural defects. I would say structural defects as verified by a professional engineer. I mean, that keeps the county, you know, if a structural engineer goes in and say this structure is inhabitable, you know, it's not safe. Go to section 6, alpha, where it says whenever petition is filed with the public officer by at least 5 residents of the county, my suggestion would be to change that to 3 unsolicited neighbors. That's to keep busybodies from riding the county and coming together and soliciting, you know, to target someone. See here, I have a note here, let me see what I'm talking about. I mean, I don't like Charlie on underneath section 6. That's really a way for the government to take somebody's property or putting an undue burden on them. And then number 9, if a dwelling is removed or demolished by a public officer, he shall sell the materials of such dwelling. I mean, what government such being will sell? I mean, it would need to go to a public auction, not. The way it's worded, it seemed like you could select your buddies to sell stuff to at a good deal. That's 9, number 9.
Yeah, I want to say that it said it has to be done in a manner consistent with the procurement code, and I'm near certain that that language is in there. But I agree. It's
And,
not, it needs to be.
and then, I think it, you know, we could be here for a while deliberating on it. This is something I would like for the planning commission to take up and work on it. Get it right. Mr. Miles, I can make a motion if you like.
I'd like to add one thing, and this is just minor. If you read through this thing, it's all in the male gender. It doesn't address any female.
Having a wife and 4 daughters, it wasn't my intention. This, again, was a function of the state law. They're still sticking with the he's.
They just must not have caught up yet.
Fair to say.
So that's just a small, but,
So I'll make a motion to direct this to the planning commission.
I'll second it.
all in favor?
That is 3-0.
I have one little comment that might be helpful. When I was down at the Association of Counties meeting, they had one county representative, I think he might have been on county council. He was telling what they did for those abandoned buildings, burnt-out buildings. They were going in and tearing them down, the county was. And then they was sticking that onto their tax bill. But I'm not positive about that, but that happened down in Lexington County, if I'm not mistaken. So if you do some research on these other counties or what they're doing.
That's in here. So we do, that is a matter of state law, and it would ultimately be, so you can, any charges, demo charges, what have you, offset by the sale of any sellable goods would be collectible in the same manner as county taxes, property taxes. And again, that's how state law is written, and I'm sure that's where they follow it from. It gives a good enforcement mechanism. I don't know how, a couple times maybe in my years have I seen that actually have to come to that. but it's there and it's helpful. You know, if you have someone who's just, ignoring what you're trying to do.
Any other comments? I don't have any other comments other than what has already been brought forward. And, so I'd make a motion to adjourn.
I second.
Second. Aye.
That is correct.